A billionaire called her people like you in front of 4 international investors. She didn't flinch. She didn't leave. She answered him in 5 languages and walked out with a $25,000 check. Hit like and subscribe. You need to hear how she did it. Have you ever watched someone brilliant shrink themselves small enough to fit inside a box that was never built for them? Not because they lost their brilliance, but because the world gave them no other choice? That's the only way to explain Naomi Carter, 28 years old, standing in the prep kitchen of the Sterling table on a rainy Tuesday night in Manhattan, polishing crystal wine glasses, with the same quiet precision she once used to draft multilingual diplomatic briefs at Howard University. If you passed her in the hallway, you would see the apron, the pulled-back locks, the careful downward tilt of her eyes that said, "I am not here. I do not take up space. I will not trouble you." You would not see the woman underneath. And that, Naomi had learned, was entirely the point. 3 years ago, Naomi Carter had been someone, not in the arrogant way that word implies, but in the truest sense. She had been a person on her way somewhere real. She graduated top of her class from Howard University's School of International Relations, fluent in 5 languages, English, French, German, Italian, and Russian, with what her linguistics professor called an auditory memory that borders on the supernatural. She had a letter of intent from an international diplomatic organization in Geneva, sitting in a cream-colored envelope on her childhood bedroom desk. She had a plan. Then the plan met reality, and reality won. Her father, James Carter, had spent 20 years building a small but steady logistics company in Baltimore. He was not a rich man, but he was a good one. The kind of man who believed that a handshake meant something and that people deserved to be treated accordingly. When a larger firm offered to partner with him, James believed them. He signed the contracts in good faith. He did not know, because he could not have known, that the partnership was a trap, a legal mechanism designed to strip his assets, absorb his client list, and leave him with nothing but debt and a lawsuit he could not afford to fight. The stroke came 6 weeks after the company collapsed. Naomi was on a flight back from a study abroad program in Berlin when her sister Grace called, voice thin and unsteady on the other end of the line. "Daddy's in the hospital. You need to come home." She came home. She did not go back. The Geneva letter stayed on the desk. Grace, 17 at the time, had been managing a chronic autoimmune condition that required specialist care, medications that cost more per month than most people's rent, and a level of medical attention that did not pause for financial crises. Naomi did the math quickly and without sentiment. The only industry in New York City that paid enough in immediate, reliable cash without requiring the kind of references and background clearances that a suddenly broke, suddenly desperate Georgetown equivalent graduate could not easily produce on short notice was high-end hospitality. She applied to the Sterling table under her middle name, the one that appeared on her resume without the Howard University header she had temporarily removed, and was hired within 48 hours. That was 3 years ago. And here's the thing about Naomi Carter that the apron never managed to cover, the thing that burned quietly beneath the surface of every carefully neutral smile and every precisely executed table setting. She never stopped. Every night after her shift, she read industry journals, maritime trade, international freight logistics, European Union shipping regulations. She maintained correspondence with a former professor at Howard who still believed, stubbornly and without evidence, that she would find her way back. She was not defeated. She was waiting. And on this particular Tuesday, in the polished back corridors of the Sterling table, the waiting was about to end. The thing about Marcus Webb was that he had mastered the art of being underestimated so thoroughly that most people forgot he was watching. He was 43 years old, the only black floor manager at the Sterling table, a man who had worked his way from busboy to his current position over 17 years of quiet, unrelenting competence. He and Naomi had never spoken about it directly. They didn't need to. It was the kind of understanding that requires no words between two people who know the same calculations by heart. He had heard her once, 2 years ago, correcting a wine order in Italian for a table that hadn't noticed, and he had filed it away the way Marcus Webb filed everything, quietly, completely, without comment. Their arrangement was simple and unspoken. Naomi did her job without complaint or error, and Marcus quietly steered the most volatile clients, the ones with too much money and too little patience, towards servers with more institutional protection and less to lose. It worked. For 3 years, it worked. Marcus found her in the dry storage room at 6:47 that evening, between towers of linen napkins and cases of imported sparkling water, and the look on his face told her immediately that tonight was going to be different. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke, as if he was still deciding whether to say what he had already decided to say. Naomi. She looked up from the inventory clipboard. She already knew, somehow, from the specific quality of the silence that preceded her name. Who is it? She asked. Whitmore, he said. Edward Whitmore. He's booked the Marble Room. Full evening. His regular interpreter got stuck in traffic on the BQE 45 minutes ago, and the dinner started without him. He's got 4 international investors at the table, and Tyler Voss is trying to hold things together with what I can only describe as aggressive optimism and very limited vocabulary. Naomi set the clipboard down. Marcus took one step into the room and lowered his voice, though there was no one else nearby. I know what I'm asking. Whitmore is? He's a specific kind of difficult. If you want me to go in there myself and apologize and take the heat, I will do that. I mean it. She looked at him for a moment. Marcus Webb, who had absorbed 17 years of specific difficulties without flinching, was offering to stand in front of this one for her. She understood what that offer cost him. She reached past him for the black silk vest hanging on the hook beside the door, the one reserved for Marble Room service, and began putting it on. I know how to handle men like him, she said. It was not bravado. It was information. Marcus nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when they hear something they believe but wish they didn't have to. I'll be right outside if you need anything, he said. She straightened the vest, checked her reflection in the dark screen of her phone, and walked toward the Marble Room. She had been waiting 3 years for a door to open. She had not expected it to look like this. The Marble Room at the Sterling table was exactly what its name implied. All pale stone surfaces and low amber light, and the kind of heavy, curated silence that cost more per square foot than most Manhattan apartments. It was a room designed to make certain people feel powerful and everyone else feel peripheral, and as Naomi pushed open the door and stepped inside, she felt both of those forces simultaneously, a familiar doubling that she had learned to absorb without expression. Edward Whitmore sat at the head of the long table like a man who had never in his life questioned whether a seat belonged to him. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that had been made specifically for his body, and he carried the particular brand of confidence that comes not from accomplishment alone, but from a lifetime of having accomplishment confirmed by every room he entered. He did not look up when Naomi came in. He was speaking, rapidly, emphatically to the young man beside him, a pale and visibly perspiring Tyler Voss, who was holding a pen over an open notebook with the expression of someone trying to bail out a sinking boat using a teaspoon. Around the table sat 4 men who could not have looked more different from one another, and yet shared a single quality: the stillness of people accustomed to waiting for other people to get things right. Henri Beaumont, the French maritime magnate, was silver-haired and precise, with the kind of face that revealed nothing until it chose to. Friedrich Braun, the German, sat with his arms folded and his jaw set, projecting the architectural solidity of a man who did not travel across the Atlantic to watch someone else's dinner fall apart. Marco Ferretti, the Italian heir, was younger than the others, dark-eyed and expressive, his fingers turning a pen over and over in a gesture that suggested he was already composing his exit speech. And Viktor Volkov, the Russian harbor operator, who had reportedly built his empire in the freezing ports of the Far East through a combination of iron will and zero sentimentality, simply sat, his vodka glass in front of him, watching everything with dark eyes that missed nothing and offered nothing in return. Naomi moved through the room quietly, efficiently, pouring water, adjusting the placement of bread plates, performing the choreography of invisibility that she had spent 3 years perfecting. And while her hands moved through their careful motions, her ears were taking in everything. Tyler Voss was not incompetent, exactly. She revised that assessment within the first 4 minutes. He was out of his depth, which is a different thing entirely. He could translate words. He could not translate a room. He did not hear the cooling edge in Beaumont's voice when a phrase landed wrong, or catch the slight forward lean of Braun's posture that meant he was interested but not yet convinced. And then Whitmore, reaching for his water glass without looking up, said to Tyler in a voice just low enough to seem private and just loud enough to carry, "What is it with staffing these days? They send me this for the Marble Room." He did not look at Naomi when he said it. He didn't need to. This, the word landed without drama, without raised voices, without anything that could be easily named or contested. It was the particular efficiency of a certain kind of contempt, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it has never, in the speaker's experience, been required to justify itself. Across the table, Henri Beaumont slowly set down his water glass. Naomi did not react. This was not suppression. It was not the white-knuckled, jaw-clenched restraint that people imagine when they picture someone absorbing an insult in silence. It was something older and more practiced than that. The learned ability to let a word pass through you without giving it a place to land, because giving it a place to land was a luxury that certain rooms did not permit. She had been absorbing words like that one since she was 9 years old, and she had learned to observe them the way a scientist observes a specimen, with precise, detached attention that gathered information without surrendering ground. So she noted it, she filed it, and she continued moving around the table. What she also noted, with the same precision, was Henri Beaumont. The French magnate had set down his glass with a quietness that was different in quality from the general quietness of the room. Deliberate, weighted, the kind of stillness that precedes a decision. He looked at Whitmore for exactly 3 seconds. Whitmore was already looking elsewhere. Beaumont's gaze moved to Naomi, and in it she read something she did not often find in this room, or rooms like it. Recognition, not pity, not the well-meaning discomfort of a witness who wants to help but doesn't know how. Simply, I see what just happened, and I have not forgotten it. She gave him the smallest possible nod, barely a movement, more a shift in the angle of her attention, and moved to refill the breadbasket. Meanwhile, Tyler Voss was attempting to bridge a conversation between Whitmore and Marco Ferretti about tax liability structures in a proposed Mediterranean shipping integration. It was. Naomi registered with quiet alarm, going very badly. Tyler's Italian was serviceable for ordering dinner and reading documents in a quiet room. It was not equipped for the rapid, idiomatic, technically specific exchange that Ferretti expected as a baseline of any serious conversation, and Ferretti's expression had moved, in the last 6 minutes, from politely attentive to visibly concerned. Friedrich Braun, for his part, had stopped writing notes, a bad sign, and was now simply watching Tyler with the expression of a structural engineer watching someone build a bridge out of the wrong materials. Viktor Volkov had not spoken in 11 minutes. In Naomi's experience, silence from someone like Volkov was never neutrality. It was assessment. She moved to the sideboard and began decanting the evening's wine, a 2004 Barolo worth considerably more than her monthly rent, and while her hands moved through their practice motions, she listened to what was happening at that table and calculated what it would cost if it continued uncorrected. Tyler said something in Italian that made Ferretti's pen go still. Naomi closed her eyes for half a second. Then she thought of her father, James Carter, who had believed in good faith and been taken apart for it, and who had never once used his misfortune as a reason to diminish someone else. She picked up the Barolo and moved toward the table. It was a small sound, barely a sound at all, really more the shape of a word than the word itself, exhaled rather than spoken, an involuntary response to something her brain flagged before her training could intercept it. Tyler had just told Marco Ferretti, in Italian, that Edward Whitmore considered Italian corporate tax structures to be essentially irrelevant to the conversation. What Whitmore had actually said was that the tax benefits of the proposed integration would outweigh the initial liabilities. The distance between those two statements was the distance between a partnership and an insult, and Naomi's mouth formed the word before she could stop it. Barely audible, directed at no one, gone almost before it arrived. Mistranslated. The room did not change. The room stilled, which is a different thing, and a more dangerous one. Whitmore turned his head toward her with the slow, controlled deliberateness of a man who has learned that speed is for people who are uncertain. He looked at her the way you look at something you have already categorized and dismissed, and are now being forced, with some irritation, to recategorize. Did you say something? His voice was pleasant. That was the thing about it, the pleasantness. It was the pleasantness of a man who has never had to raise his voice because the lowered version has always been sufficient. Naomi met his gaze. I apologize, sir. It was nothing. She moved a step back, to return to the invisible middle distance where service professionals live during moments like this, to let the moment dissolve the way 100 similar moments had dissolved before it. But Whitmore was already standing, not abruptly, not with the theatrical violence of someone losing control, but with the measured, deliberate motion of someone choosing to make a point. He straightened his jacket. He looked at her with an expression that managed to be simultaneously calm and annihilating. You know what the problem is, he said, and his voice was still even, still conversational, as though he were sharing an observation with a colleague rather than addressing a woman whose name he did not know. With how things get run these days, competence is an afterthought. You put people where they don't belong, and then everyone's surprised when it doesn't work. He paused. The pause was precise. People like you don't belong in this room. The sentence was constructed to be unanswerable. It was not a slur, not technically, not legally, not in any way that could be pointed to and named in an HR report. It was the architecture of exclusion built so carefully that it could pass through a room full of witnesses without leaving a mark that anyone could agree on after the fact. People like you. Across the table, Henri Beaumont set his knife down. Not loudly, not with any gesture that announced itself. He simply set it down, and the sound it made against the plate, soft, precise, deliberate, was the quietest possible version of a man deciding something. He looked at Whitmore. Then he looked at Naomi. Then he said, in English accented with the particular elegance of a man who had spoken 4 languages before most Americans had finished learning 1, Edward, that is enough. 3 words. He did not elaborate. He did not raise his voice, or itemize the offense or construct an argument. He simply named the line and declined to let it move any further. Whitmore looked at him. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. Not with the satisfaction of a movie moment, but genuinely, the way a temperature shifts. She can stay, Beaumont said. And then he looked at Naomi, and in French, quietly, only for her, said, Je vous en prie, mademoiselle. Continue as. Please, miss. Continue. There is a moment. Naomi had read about it in a linguistics paper once, in the context of simultaneous interpreters working high-pressure diplomatic sessions, where the brain stops performing competence and simply is competent. Where training and instinct stop being things you reach for and become instead the ground you are standing on. She felt it now, not as confidence, as recognition. The room needed something she had, and she was done pretending otherwise. She did not make a speech. She placed the Barolo carefully in its silver cradle, smoothed the front of her vest once with both hands, and turned toward the table with the posture of a woman who had stopped performing invisibility because invisibility no longer served the situation. She looked at Whitmore for exactly 1 second, not with anger, not with the satisfaction of someone about to retaliate, but with the calm, appraising look of a professional who has assessed the scope of the problem and is now deciding where to begin. Mr. Whitmore, she said, and her voice was different, not louder, not harder, simply unmistakably different. The voice of someone who has stopped modulating themselves for someone else's comfort. There have been some significant translation errors in the last 20 minutes that I believe are affecting the tone of this conversation. If you'll allow me, I'd like to try to correct them. Whitmore stared at her. He had been stared down by senators, by regulators, by hedge fund managers who had 15 lawyers behind them. He had never, in his memory, been addressed by a server with the particular quality of authority that this woman was projecting at him across a mahogany table, and the sheer unexpectedness of it created a half-second of silence in which he did not, for once, know what to say. Tyler Voss looked at Naomi with an expression caught exactly between relief and shame. He opened his mouth, then he closed it. Then, and this was the moment Naomi would remember longest. Not the confrontations or the negotiations or the check at the end of the evening, but this. Tyler quietly pushed his notepad across the table toward her and said, low enough that only she could hear, "You're doing better than me. I'll take notes." It was not dramatic. It cost him something real to say it. She could see that in the tight set of his jaw, the deliberate way he kept his eyes on the table, and he said it anyway, because it was true, and because the truth of it mattered more to him in that moment than the comfort of pretending otherwise. Naomi looked at him. She gave him a nod, brief, sincere, without condescension. Then she turned toward Henri Beaumont, and when she spoke, the language that came out of her mouth was not English. It was French, not textbook French, not the careful, slightly formal French of someone demonstrating competence, but the fluid, naturally accented French of someone who had spent 3 months in Paris arguing philosophy in corner cafes and had never quite let it go. Beaumont's eyebrows rose, not with surprise, exactly, with the particular pleasure of a man who has made a correct assessment. She did not perform. That was the thing that would be almost impossible to convey to someone who wasn't in that room. The complete absence of theater in what Naomi did over the next 90 minutes. She was not avenging herself. She was not making a point. She was simply doing what she had been trained to do and had been prevented from doing for 3 years, and the fluency of it, the ease, was its own kind of devastating argument against everything Whitmore had implied about her. With Beaumont, in French, she rebuilt the foundation of the conversation from the point where Tyler's translation had first begun to drift. She explained, in the vocabulary of maritime commerce, what Whitmore's actual proposal entailed: the infrastructure integration, the shared terminal operations, the projected reduction in demurrage charges across the Atlantic freight lanes. She was precise, she was respectful, and she was careful to frame Whitmore's intentions as generously as the facts permitted, because she was not here to destroy the man. She was here to rescue the table. Beaumont listened with the focused, unguarded attention of someone receiving information they had been trying to access for 2 hours. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his wine glass, the one he had set aside 40 minutes earlier, and took a slow, deliberate sip. That, in Beaumont's language, was a yes. With Braun, in German, she shifted registers entirely. Shorter sentences, more concrete, heavy on the technical specificity that the German logistics magnate had been waiting for since he arrived. She addressed the Hamburg bottleneck question directly, outlining the autoschufe-related clearance system that Whitmore's team had developed, and that Tyler had been unable to describe in sufficient detail to be convincing. She projected a 45% reduction in processing delays. Braun's arms uncrossed. He leaned forward 3 inches. He picked up his pen. These were, Naomi knew, the gestures of a man who had decided to stay in the room. With Ferretti, in Italian, she was warmer, more expressive, more attentive to the relational dimension of the conversation that the Italian heir had been quietly mourning since the tax liability misunderstanding had made him feel accused of something he hadn't done. She apologized on no one's behalf and everyone's. She clarified. She made him feel, without flattering him, that his concerns had been heard and that the table was capable of taking them seriously. Ferretti's pen went still in his fingers. He smiled, small, cautious, but real. And then she felt it before she saw it, the weight of Viktor Volkov's attention shifting in her direction. The Russian had not moved. He had not spoken. He had simply been present in the way that certain extremely dangerous things are present, quietly, completely, and with the absolute patience of something that has decided it will act when it is ready, and not a moment before. When she met his eyes, he said, in Russian, which hit her ears like cold water and familiar music simultaneously, "Do you actually speak this? Or are you guessing?" She answered him in Russian without pausing. "I speak it. Ask me something real if you want to find out." For the first time all evening, Viktor Volkov's expression changed. It was not a smile, it was something more restrained and more meaningful than that. The slight easing of a face that has been braced against disappointment and has found, unexpectedly, that there is none. Whitmore had not spoken in 40 minutes. This was, for a man whose primary professional instrument was his voice, an almost physiological experience, like a pianist sitting on his hands while someone else performed his concerto. But better. He watched Naomi move through the languages with an expression that passed through several distinct phases. First irritation, then confusion, then something he chose not to name, settling finally into a tight, rigid silence that was the closest thing to neutral he could manage. He tried, twice, to reassert himself. The first time, he interrupted a moment of consensus between Naomi and Braun to restate something he had already said, slightly louder, as though volume was the variable that had been missing, and Braun simply looked at him with the flat patience of a man who had already moved on and was waiting for the interruption to finish. The second time, Whitmore addressed Naomi directly. "I think we have what we need. Thank you. You can step back now." Naomi paused. She looked at him, not confrontationally, not with the heightened electricity of someone spoiling for a fight, but with a steadiness that was in some ways worse, because it suggested she had considered and rejected the option of being intimidated. Then Beaumont said, in English, without looking up from the contract summary he was reviewing, "Actually, I'd like her to stay." Which settled it. The dinner concluded. The terms were not finalized. That would take weeks of formal legal process. But the foundation was laid, and everyone at the table knew it. And everyone at the table knew who had laid it. As the investors gathered their materials and exchanged the particular handshakes of men who have arrived at a cautious mutual trust, Beaumont approached Naomi near the sideboard and pressed his card into her hand with both of his. which was a French gesture that meant considerably more than handing someone a business card. He spoke to her quietly in French. "Call me. My organization is conducting a search for a communications advisory role in Paris. International freight. Diplomatic liaison. I'd like you to speak with our director of personnel. Consider this a personal introduction." Then he left. Friedrich Braun paused at the door, looked at her directly, and said in English, unornamented, factual, Braun to the last, "You're very good at this." Then he left. Marco Ferretti kissed her hand, which she had not expected, and said grazie davvero, "Thank you, truly," in the tone of voice reserved for people who have pulled you back from the edge of something you would have regretted. Viktor Volkov walked past her without stopping, and as he did, said in Russian barely above a murmur, "Horoshaya igra, shachmatist." Good game, chess player. And then she was alone in the marble room with Whitmore, who had not moved from his chair. He was looking at the table, after a long silence, during which Naomi quietly collected the evening's materials and prepared to leave. He said, not loudly, not with any ceremony, "You did good work tonight." It was not an apology. She did not mistake it for one, but it was something. The reluctant, minimal honesty of a man who has been confronted with a truth he cannot entirely ignore, which is sometimes, Naomi had learned, the most you can expect from a room like this. She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she said. Before she reached the door, she paused. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I'd like to discuss a consulting fee for this evening." Given the scope of what was required, Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Name your number." She named it. He did not negotiate. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and removed his checkbook, which was either the action of a man who respected efficiency or a man who had decided that arguing with her was no longer worth his time. She suspected both were true. She folded the check once, placed it in the pocket of her vest, and walked out. The kitchen at the end of a long service had its own particular quality of exhaustion. Not the sharp, adrenaline-edged tiredness of the dinner rush, but something slower and more human, the collective deflation of a group of people who had held everything together for 5 hours and were now, quietly, letting themselves come apart at the edges. Naomi pushed through the swinging door and stood for a moment in the warmth and noise and familiar disorder of it, feeling the marble room's heavy silence fall away from her like a coat she'd been wearing too long. Marcus was at the expediting station, reviewing the closeout sheets, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who has spent the last 5 hours exercising enormous self-restraint and is only now permitting himself to exhale. He looked at her. She looked at him. "How bad was it?" he asked. "Survivable," she said, which, between the two of them, communicated everything. She looked at Marcus for a moment. "I'm going to transfer something to the staff fund this week," she said, "for tonight's kitchen crew. I made considerably more than any of them, and I didn't carry a single plate to the main floor." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she didn't entirely have words for, something between respect and the particular pain of bearing witness to someone who has been treated as less than they are for so long that generosity has become their first instinct. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the point." She changed out of the silk vest and back into her street clothes, moving through the familiar muscle memory of end-of-shift routine. And when she emerged from the break room, Tyler Voss was waiting in the corridor. He was holding his jacket and his notebook and looking like someone who had been rehearsing what to say and had now forgotten all of it. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. A pause. "I should have said something," he said. I should have said something earlier. "Before you did." She considered him for a moment. He was young, younger than she'd registered during the dinner, when he'd been vibrating with professional stress. He looked, now, like someone who had learned something tonight that he hadn't gone looking for and wasn't sure what to do with yet. "You gave me your notepad," she said. "Yeah," he said. "That was something." He nodded. Not satisfied exactly, she didn't think he should be satisfied, and she thought he understood that, but present with it, which was the beginning of something. "Good luck with the Paris thing," he said. She paused. She had not mentioned Paris to anyone. He noticed her expression. "Beaumont has a habit of switching to French when he thinks no one is listening," Tyler said. "I took 2 semesters at NYU. Enough to follow the general direction, not enough to have been any use tonight." There was something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth. Almost. She walked out of the Sterling table into the rain-slick Manhattan night and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the city noise settle around her. Her phone buzzed. Grace. Hey, you okay? You're usually home by now. Grace's voice was the same voice it had always been, slightly lower than you'd expect, with a particular warmth of someone who has spent a significant portion of their life in waiting rooms and has developed, out of necessity, an unusual patience with uncertainty. Naomi pressed the phone against her ear and leaned against the building's exterior wall, watching yellow cabs slide through the wet street. I'm okay, she said. Better than okay, actually. What happened? Long story. I have time. I know you do. I'll tell you when I get home. A pause. Then Grace said with the particular gentleness of someone who has learned to read the spaces between words. Naomi, tell me something went right tonight. The check was in her coat pocket. $25,000 folded once. 6 months of Grace's specialist appointments. 3 months of back rent. A winter, finally, ending. Yeah, Naomi said. We're going to be okay. She heard Grace exhale on the other end of the line. Slow, full, the sound of someone who has been holding their breath for longer than they realized, and is only now, at the permission of those 5 words, allowing themselves to stop. They stayed on the phone for a few minutes without saying much, and Naomi listened to the sound of her sister's voice and looked at the wet city and did not perform anything for anyone. In the morning, Naomi called the number on Beaumont's card. His assistant answered on the second ring, and when Naomi gave her name, there was a brief pause, and then, yes, Mr. Beaumont mentioned you might call. Let me find a time for you to speak with our Paris office. 3 weeks later, after 2 conversations with Beaumont's director of personnel, one over video call, one that ran 2 hours longer than scheduled, she received a formal offer. Paris. With a Geneva trajectory. The salary was the kind that made the last 3 years feel, for one complicated moment, both wasted and entirely necessary. The work matched, finally, the size of the mind she had been folding into smaller and smaller shapes for 3 years. She accepted in French, because it felt right. The day before her flight, she went back to the Sterling table, not in an apron, not carrying anything, just herself, and sat down at a table in the main dining room and ordered a coffee. Marcus brought it out personally, set it in front of her, and stood there for a moment. First time I've seen you on that side of the table, he said. First time I've let myself sit here, she said. He nodded, the way Marcus nodded when something confirmed what he already knew. Before she left, she went to the front desk and asked to leave something for the staff scholarship fund, a modest program the restaurant ran for employees pursuing further education. The envelope had no name on it. Inside was a check, and a single index card on which she had written, in her small, precise handwriting, "Talent doesn't see color. Opportunity shouldn't either." She walked out into the April morning, pale sun breaking through the last of the clouds, the city already loud and indifferent and full of people carrying things no one else could see, and hailed a cab to JFK. She had a plane to catch. She had always had a plane to catch. The world had simply taken 3 years to figure that out. If this story moved you even a little, hit like and subscribe so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest, and where in the world are you watching this from?